A conversation with Harriet Tubman, titled Called to be Moses. The scene tonight is Auburn, New York, the home of Abner Doubleday, the supposed inventor of baseball, but more important for our purposes, also the home of William Seward, New York governor, United States senator, and Secretary of State under Presidents Lincoln and Johnson, and home of Harriet Tubman, a former slave who worked tirelessly to help slaves escape from slavery to freedom in the North. Secretary Seward, also an ardent abolitionist, sold a house to Harriet in Auburn, and the city became a haven for escaped African American slaves before the Civil War. Secretary Seward returned home when Ulysses S. Grant became president in 1869, which is when this conversation took place.
Why, Mr. Seward, it surely is nice to see you in Auburn again.
Thank you, Mrs. Tubman, for saying that. I'm glad to be back home and finally to be freed from Washington. How's the house I sold you?
Quite nice, thank you. It surely has served me well as I've brought my relatives here from the South. You know, they needed to escape from slavery.
I'm glad the house has served you well. I was hoping that selling you this house would be a big help to our abolitionist movement.
It sure was a help to me. I mean, you're glad to be free from Washington, but you don't know how glad those 300 slaves that I freed and brought here from the South feel about being out from under that yoke of slavery. Or the 750 that I freed during the Civil War.
You really were a Moses, freeing the slaves.
Oh, that's what some people called me. But they also called me general because of how I helped in the Civil War. I was the only woman who led an assault in the Civil War. But whatever people call me, what's really important is that God called me to do this. My vision, God directed me to free the slaves.
I don't know if I should call you Moses or General Tubman. What are you doing now that the war's over?
Well, the slaves may be free, but many are poor. I'm raising money to help build schools for black children. But I'm beginning to think that that's not the only thing I should be working on, that there are others who need freedom.
What do you mean?
Have you heard about Sojourner Truth?
Of course, she's a former slave like you. She's been preaching a long time about freeing slaves. Lived for a while in New York, but she's in Michigan now, I believe. Doesn't she talk about how God called her to preach against slavery?
Absolutely right. That's why she changed her name to Sojourner Truth. But she's preaching about something else now.
She is? Is there some kind of slavery I'm not aware of?
Perhaps. She's been preaching about equal rights for women. Black men who were slaves can vote now, but women, whether they're white or black, don't have the vote.
Don't tell me you're going to become one of those suffragettes.
I surely am, Mr. Seward. Just as slaves have a right to be free, I believe women have a right to vote. God's calling me to work for their freedom, too.
But women's place is in the House.
Yes, and in the Senate as well.
Touché, Mrs. Tubman. I suppose you'd add the governor's mansion and the White House also. I don't know, Miss Tubman. This could be quite upsetting.
Yes, it could. But God has always called me to seek freedom and justice for people, even if it was dangerous or risky.
Well, your work to free slaves and even participate in the Civil War surely was dangerous and risky. But I fear you may continue to see how dangerous and risky it is because change is threatening and people in power don't like to be challenged.
I know, but I know God will be with me. I can't stop what I'm doing now.
Well then, you don't think that your work is done?
Not at all. I believe that God has work for me to do as long as there's people oppressed and suffering from injustice.
I imagine your work will never be done. As long as people pursue power and financial success rather than the common good and compassion for people in need, it'll be important to stand up for justice.
Unfortunately, I believe you are exactly right.
Besides your work for freeing slaves, educating their children, and for women, I wonder who we'll have to stand up for.
That is a good question. But whoever is oppressed and wherever there's injustice, I believe we are called by God to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly before our God.
Those are marching orders to keep constant vigilance for where work on justice is needed.
Yes, we need to keep our eyes open to where the work is. We need to keep that justice and freedom going all through the world.
So God's call didn't stop when slavery ended.
No, it didn't. There's still as much work to do for black folk and for women and for many others too. My visions leave me with another question though. How can I keep from seeking justice for oppressed people?